I think they're live now, Sarab.
They're live now?
I think there's something that says meeting is.
Oh, it says live. Okay, so
please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so we start the program now. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining in. Tonight we have with us Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Of course, I'm going to do the ritual of introducing him formally, but before that, maybe I'll start on a personal note, very briefly, of course. I of course knew Professor Bilgrami's work, but I actually had an introduction for the first time when I was in dire straits during my PhD at NYU. I was trying to form my doctoral committee, and my third member had backed out somehow, who was supposed to be from NYU, because she felt she was not well equipped to handle the kind of work I was doing. So I desperately sent an email to Professor Bilgrami. He was in Germany at the time, giving a lecture there, attending a conference, and he wrote back immediately. He said, "I'll be very happy to be part of your doctoral committee." And that's how my association with Professor Bilgrami started. He bailed me out at that time. And since then, I've been admiring, of course, I was admiring his work, but I've also been admiring him because of his generosity, kindness, and I would say compassion. He has been very, very kind, actually, and very humble. Humility is something that I don't see nowadays in many scholars. So these are the qualities, I think, apart from his intellectual work, that I always have admired, and I think very highly of these things. And I've been also, like many others around the globe, I have been working and following his work on secularism. And I was recently also looking up his latest work, which is the edited book on secularism called Beyond the Secular West, where he's again going back to the debates on secularism following Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age. And then he asked this question: can these ideas be transplanted that easily in the non-West? And he has got a very interesting set of people, apart from Charles Taylor, of course, who have written on secularism in many parts of the globe. That's a very interesting book. And I'm going to come to it, of course, when I read out his bio. So without much ado, I'm going to read out his bio, though he doesn't need any introduction at all. I would say we at JGU and JGLS are honored and privileged to have him tonight in India, and of course, morning in New York at the moment. And it's a privilege to have him. And we are really grateful that he has agreed to talk on something that is very topical and something that we are debating on for a long time, the ideas of liberalism. And again, the same idea of whether this can be, applied, these ideas can be applied, or these ideas could be universalized in a sense in the non-West. So we are going to hear on that from Professor Bilgrami. But before we do that, I would like to briefly read out his bio. I mean, as I said, I dare not introduce him because he doesn't need it. But still, as a ritual, I'm just briefly going to read out his bio before we start the lecture. Professor Akeel Bilgrami got a BA in English Literature from Elphinstone College, Bombay University, and went to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, where he read philosophy, politics, and economics. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He has held the Johnsonian Professorship of Philosophy and holds the Sidney Morgenbesser Chair of Philosophy at Columbia University, where he is also a professor on the Committee on Global Thought. He has been the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities, as well as the South Asian Institute at Columbia. He is the editor of the Journal of Philosophy and also the president of its board of trustees. His publications include the books Belief and Meaning, published in 1992, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, published in 2006, and Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, 2014. And this book has come out, Secularism, Identity, Enchantment, from Harvard University Press. It contains revised essays, which Professor Bilgrami has been publishing for a while. And he has also published over 100 articles on topics ranging from the nature of meaning to the relation between religion, society, and culture. And he's due to publish 2 books, which I'm very much looking forward to. One is called What is a Muslim, to be published by Princeton University Press. And the other one is Gandhi, the Philosopher, to be published by Columbia University Press. And those who have followed Professor Bilgrami's work, we know that he has been also working on Gandhi for a long time now. His longer-term future work is on the relations between value, agency, and practical reason. He has held visiting positions at Oxford University, Yale University, JNU, Australian National University, and he has received a number of awards from the National Institute of the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Luce Foundation, twice from the Mellon Foundation, and the Social Scientist of the Year Award in 2015 in India. He has served on the jury of the Architecture Award for the Aga Khan Foundation, as well as on the jury for the Infosys Humanities Prize for the last several years, and is its current jury chairman. Professor Bilgrami lives in New York and is married with 1 daughter. Now, may I invite Professor Bilgrami to deliver his keenly anticipated lecture tonight.
Thank you very much, Musarraf. It's very nice to be a Jindal. I don't think I've ever spoken there, and so it's, even if it's online, I'm very glad to be asked and to be speaking. You know, I'm going to try and speak today on the concept of liberty and the concept of rights, and I'd like to show some of the limitations of liberal philosophy, liberalism as a doctrine, and try and see how, if at all, it can be fortified and made more secure than it is. And I will conclude with some remarks about India today and about the possibilities of liberalism for India in the future. Let me begin, but I'll begin more theoretically, more philosophically, because what I'd like to do is to convey a little bit about, you know, everybody knows a lot about constitutions, about the concept of rights, of fundamental rights, and their legal and constitutional aspects. But I'd like to try and dig a little further down. I don't want to say deeper because that sounds self-congratulatory, but I want to capture the mentality that underlies liberal thinking, secular liberal thinking. But I'm focusing on liberalism more than secularism for the purposes of this talk, because I really want to talk about rights and constitutions. So I want to look at the philosophy underlying it, if you like, the cognitive attitudes and mentality that underlies liberalism, and try and show what their limitations are, what the limitations of the thinking is behind liberalism. So let me begin with what is perhaps the most honored and long-standing slogan of liberal doctrine. I'm going to put it on the screen. This is, I'm going to highlight it here. What I've highlighted in blue, can you all see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So this here is probably liberalism's most long-standing and deep and honored commitment. The slogan here: individual citizens must be left unimpeded to pursue their own values and conceptions of the good life, to pursue their own values. So it's the basic idea of liberty in all liberal societies and polities is captured in this very, very general slogan. Now, notice at the beginning, I point out that there's some built-in constraints. That is, you can't be completely free to do anything you like because you can't harm people and so on and so forth. So long as no harm is being caused, you should be left free to pursue your own values and your own conceptions of the good life. Okay, now if you stare at the slogan for a while, I want you to notice that there's a tremendous difference between the first half of the slogan and the second half of the slogan in the following sense. The first half of the slogan is capturing the value of non-interference in people's lives. The first half mentions one kind of value, liberty as non-interference, right? People must be left unimpeded. Unimpeded means you can't interfere with them. So for liberalism, non-interference in people's lives, non-interference by the state, non-interference by other individuals, and so on. So non-interference is a very deep commitment of liberalism, and it's captured in the first half of the slogan. It's a value. We value it, and liberal polities value it above all. Now, the second half of the slogan, they must be left uninterfered to pursue their own values and conceptions of the good life. This that I've put in bold captures a different concept of values than the first. So examples of this kind of value are values and conceptions of the good life, like somebody might value Islam, somebody might value Christianity, somebody might value socialism. Those are all large, comprehensive doctrines, but it can be also very specific things. Somebody can value a life playing cricket, or if you're my age, a life watching cricket, or a life in the theater, or a life in the cinema, etc. So these are just, the second half of the slogan mentions substantive values: Islam, Christianity, playing cricket, theater, opera, whatever you like. I mean, these are going for long walks. These are all values we have. Listening to music. They're very different from the value of non-interference. So that's the first thing to notice about the most basic commitment of liberalism, that the first half of the slogan mentions a value, let's call it non-interference. The second half mentions a quite different kind of value, substantive values. Right? Okay. Now, what is the difference between these two kinds of value? This that liberalism is committed to, and this is supposed to enable the pursuit of these. But the nature of these is very different from this enabling value. Right? This value is an enabler of the pursuit of these. And liberalism is deeply committed to this because it enables the pursuit of these more substantive values. Okay. Now, the main thing that liberalism then adds to this slogan, which I've divided into two parts, is that the value of non-interference is different from substantive values. It's qualitatively different. You can't weigh non-interference on the same scale as substantive values. There's something special about it. You can't just say, oh, well, non-interference is just like one of these values. No, it's qualitatively set apart for liberalism from these other values. You can't weigh them on the same scale. Right? So it's fundamental to liberalism that not only is its main commitment captured in the slogan, but the slogan makes the value mentioned in the first half of the slogan as essentially qualitatively set apart from all the other values that it enables. They're not comparable. Okay, so what is the qualitative difference between the two? Why can't they be weighed on the same scale? And the answer is, you can't justify non-interference as a value. You can't legitimate non-interference as a value for liberalism on the basis of these other values. You can't justify this value on the basis of any of these values. So you can't say, my Christianity, from within my Christian values, I believe I should, in liberal freedom in the sense of non-interference. No. Why not? Because somebody might not believe in Christianity. So this must have more secure foundations than these, because these are contestable values. Somebody can believe in Islam, somebody can repudiate Islam. Somebody can believe in Christianity, somebody else won't believe in Christianity. Somebody can believe in socialism, others will not. So if these are grounded in or justified by appeal to any of these values, then this value will be to that extent contestable. Because these values are variably held. Not everybody believes in Islam, Christianity, etc. Right? So these cannot justify, these cannot be the basis of one's commitment to this. Because these are all variably held, whereas you want more secure foundations for this. You want this to be something that everybody can accept, whether they're Muslims, Christians, whatever, right? Lovers of cricket, etc. So this must be supported without appeal to these values. Right? That's an essential commitment. Okay. Now, so let me justifying the former as value. You can't justify it because these are contestable and unstable. One needs more secure foundations for non-interference, for liberty. Okay? So this is liberty as non-interference. It enables these. It's qualitatively different from these, and it can't be justified on the basis of these because these are variably held. And if they are variably held, then if you appeal to something here to justify this, somebody might say, well, since I don't agree with the substantive value, I don't have to agree with this. So these need a different foundation, a different ground for believing in them, different justification than anything that appeals to these. That's all essential to liberalism. You can't be a liberal without believing in all that. Okay? Now, what that means is you've got to find grounds for this, for believing in liberty, which no matter what substantive values you have, you will accept. Right? We must have more universal grounds for this. Okay. So let me look at two philosophers who try to give you foundations for liberty, for non-interference, without appealing to any substantive values at all. Give it secure, universal foundations. So John Stuart Mill, in a famous book called On Liberty, gives you this extremely well-known argument. It's probably the most famous argument for liberty in the history of liberal thought. And almost all liberal thinkers subscribe to it. Oliver Wendell Holmes's idea of a marketplace of ideas is basically repeating what Mill says. Mill's argument for liberty, which tries to give it foundations that are absolutely secure, that everybody must accept, whatever their substantive values are, is the following argument. It has two premises. The first premise is, we have held many false beliefs in the past. The second premise is just an induction based on this. Just as, therefore, many of our current beliefs, however convinced we are of them, may be false. Right? This just P2, second premise, follows from the first premise. Is by induction. Well, induction is the logical reasoning which says, which goes from observations of the past to conclusions about the present and future. Right? All crows that have been observed in the past have been black, therefore all crows are black. That's a standard example of inductive reasoning. All right, so we have held many false beliefs in the past, therefore many of our current beliefs, however convinced we are of them, may be false. From this, Mill concludes, we should tolerate dissent, i.e. beliefs that go against our current convictions, in case our current convictions are false and those dissenting beliefs are true. So this is his argument for non-interference. This conclusion is the conclusion of non-interference in speech. So let's just focus on free speech, non-interference in speech. I mean, there are all sorts of other non-interference. You can't interfere in people's worship, you know, their religion. You can't interfere in people's associations, you know, the freedom to associate. But speech is by far the most central of all liberal commitments to liberty. The domain of speech and expression and discussion and so on. Okay, so the conclusion of this argument is we've held many false beliefs in the past, therefore many of our current beliefs, however convinced we are of them, may be false. So we should tolerate dissent against our current beliefs or convictions in case our current convictions are false, which this allows, insists on, and the dissenting beliefs are true. So that's a reason to tolerate dissent. That's a reason to have free speech, non-interference in speech. Now notice, this argument is something that Mill says everybody can believe, because all they need to do is be capable of induction. Right? This is universal reasoning. Anybody can grasp this argument. You don't have, you know, it's not coming from any substantive commitment to Islam or Christianity or to socialism or whatever. It's coming from pure logical reasoning, inductive reasoning. Not deductive, but inductive. You see the induction from P1 to P2, and you conclude this from these two. And this argument for free speech, for non-interference in speech, has had a tremendous influence. In fact, if you look up any case law in any liberal societies, India, US, Britain, South Africa, you will find in case law, you will find judges constantly saying that you can get to the truth only if you allow free speech, because the most dissenting opinion might be true. How do you know it is not true? Let everybody speak and the truth will come out. Right? It's called the marketplace of ideas metaphor. Let 100 flowers bloom metaphors are all metaphors that are summing up Mill's argument. They're slogans for Mill's argument. Okay. Now, if all that is clear, I say this is an argument which has had tremendous influence, and almost everybody you ask when they first come across it seems to think it's absolutely convincing. But I think it's a numbing fallacy. I'm not going to be able to convince you that it's a fallacy in a very short while, but let me raise some problems with it. One problem is that this premise here, we have held many false beliefs in the past, is something it's judgment we come to from our present point of view. Right? But this premise here is saying that our present point of view might be false. But that means this premise here is shaky. Think of it. Take the first premise. When we say many of our false beliefs are, many of our past beliefs are false, we are making the judgment from what we now believe. So take, for example, the belief that the earth is flat. Right? For centuries, people believed that. Right? It's false. But to say it's false is something we say from our current understanding, right? Our current science. But this is telling us that our current beliefs might be false. So if this is based on this, then to that extent, this is shaky. What kind of an argument is this? Its fundamental first premise is shaky. Okay, a second problem with this, I'm going to be quick now because a second problem with it is, it may take quite a long time for me to present why the second. So I just wanted you to be unsettled about the obviousness of this argument. I now want to turn to another argument, but first understand that the reason why I presented this argument is because it fulfills the liberal desideratum. It fulfills the liberal requirement that you must argue for free speech, or you must argue for non-interference in the domain. We are focusing on speech only, just for the sake of convenience. You must argue for non-interference without appeal to any substantive values. Well, this makes no appeal to any substantive values. It just makes an appeal to your capacity to reason inductively from here to here. And once you've got both these premises, this follows. Anybody who's capable of induction can see this, no matter what substantive values they have. It's universal foundations it claims to have. And I've tried to show that it's a very shaky argument because its first premise is shaky. By its own lights, its first premise is shaky. Okay, I'm going to switch now to a more recent philosopher. And this is a more sophisticated argument, but it has the same goal: to give you a commitment to liberty, among other things, on the basis of no substantive values at all. Rawls's remarkable book, A Theory of Justice, it's a noble work. It's extraordinarily sophisticated and interesting, and maybe the most sophisticated work of liberal political theory and philosophy. What Rawls is doing in this book, in this great work, is this. He's saying, I'm going to give you a method. It's a contractual method. He's part of a social contract tradition of political theory. He says, I'm going to give you a method in which, if you follow my method in choosing principles to live by, you could not choose principles which are biased in your own favor. It would be, if you follow my method, it will be impossible for any person to choose principles to live by for the society, for the group, for the polity, that are biased in his or her own favor. That's what he calls justice as fairness. That's the idea of what he calls justice. Justice for him is the idea that we have principles to live by which are not biased in our own favor. And he says, I'm going to give you a method whereby principles that are biased in your own favor are impossible to choose if you follow the method. So what is that method? The method is this. He says, imagine we are a group. So let's say everybody, however many of us there are, 40, 50 people, suppose we belong, it's, social contracts. What is a social contract? A social contract is the idea that people get together. I mean, this is all imagined. This is it's not a historical fact. It's a historical conjecture. That people get together and they're mere people. They get together and they choose principles to live by freely, choose principles, consent to principles to live by. And as soon as they do so, they become citizens. And the original position or state of nature, as it's sometimes called, becomes a polity. So we are all in a state of nature. Let's say 50 of us, we're in a state of nature, unconstructed nature, right? Rawls calls it the original position. Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau called it the state of nature. So here we are in a state of nature, just a bunch of men and women. And we say, we're going to choose principles to live by. As soon as we freely consent to certain principles to live by, we are transformed from mere people into citizens. The state of nature is transformed into a polity. That's the idea of it. And the idea is that a social contract of this kind is rational if people are better off after this contract than they were in the state of nature. So it's what is called economists would call it a Pareto improvement over the state of nature. Okay, so that's the idea of And he says, here's my method. My method is everybody behind, my method, he says, is that all of us who are in this group, the method which will yield only fair principles, or principles that are not biased in anyone's favor, is that each one of us knows general things about human beings, but we don't know any particular thing about ourselves. So I don't know I'm an Indian. I don't know I'm a socialist. I don't know I'm from a Muslim background. I don't know that I love cricket. I love Hindustani classical music, that I love Bob Dylan, that I love Beethoven. I don't know any of these things about myself. I have just general knowledge of human subjects, human beings. So there's a veil of ignorance. I don't know who I am. And if I don't know who I am, I don't know what my substantive values are. You don't know. Musarraf doesn't know. Wajahat Bhai doesn't know. Ravi Bhutalingam doesn't know. Sayyida Imam doesn't know. Nobody, no one of us who's contracting in the social contract knows that she is Sayyida Imam, he is Ravi Bhutalingam, he is Wajahat Habibullah. None of us know any of these things about ourselves. We don't know who we are. We don't know our social properties. Like I'm an Indian, nothing. I don't know that I'm a professor. Wajahat doesn't know that he's been a distinguished bureaucrat of the Congress, successive Congress governments. Sayyida Imam doesn't know that she's a distinguished advertising executive. Ravi Bhutalingam doesn't know that he was chairman of Wazir Sultan. Nothing. None of these things are known to themselves. They're choosing without knowledge of themselves as particular people, just a general knowledge. Okay? So as a result, they don't know their substantive values. Okay. Now, another important element of the method is this. It's extremely important. And here is what Rawls says about it. Rawls says, behind the veil of ignorance, when we are choosing principles to live by, without knowing who we are and what we value, substantively value, he says, you can't gamble. So for instance, I can't say, oh, well, there are hardly any socialists left in the world today, right? Everybody is, there's such a, so forget it. So it's very unlikely that when the veil of ignorance is lifted and I find out who I am, that I will be a socialist. Well, what's the chance of that? There's hardly any socialists left in the world today. So I should accept the principle of private property behind the veil of ignorance. It's very unlikely that I'm going to turn out to be a socialist when the veil of ignorance is lifted. Right, so let me gamble. Say, okay, what is the chance I'm a socialist? Maybe 5%, 10%? So forget it. Let me choose private property as a principle to contract into behind the veil of ignorance. Rawls says, no, gambling is not allowed. Why? Because when the veil of ignorance is lifted, if I turn out to be a socialist, if I lose my gamble, I'm going to say, damn it, I shouldn't have chosen private property. Right? And Rawls says, no, that can't be right. You must be able to wholeheartedly live with what you've chosen behind the veil of ignorance when the veil of ignorance is lifted. But if you've chosen the principle of private property and when the veil of ignorance is lifted, you discover you're a socialist, you're not going to wholeheartedly live with the principle. You're going to be cussing. So gambling is ruled out. Okay, that's what he calls my risk-averse method. Okay, so he then says, if gambling is ruled out, then this instruction follows to each contractor. Each contractor is told, choose according to your rational self-interest. So Musarraf chooses, Wajahat Sahib chooses, Ravi chooses, I choose. All of us are told, choose that principle to live by according to your own rational self-interest, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil is lifted. Since gambling is ruled out, this is the instruction you must, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil is lifted, you will choose that principle. That strictly follows from disallowing gambling, right? Okay, so that's the instruction given to every contractor. Choose a principle to live by according to your rational self-interest, no matter what you imagine yourself. Or to put it differently, no matter what your substantive values are. That's just what the liberal says. He's just doing exactly what Mill did. He's doing exactly what I said the liberal philosophy requires of free speech, must be justified without appeal to any substantive values, no matter what you imagine your substantive values to be. Okay. He then says, rational contractors using this method would choose a range of liberties, including liberty of speech. He says that we choose two principles. This is the first of his principles. He says, following my instructions, we will choose liberty of speech. Akeel will choose it, Musarraf will choose it, Wajahat Sahib will choose it, Ravi will choose it, Sayyida will choose it, all the others, all of us will choose it. Okay? Now, when he said this, there was a huge protest against him by a whole range of philosophers who call themselves communitarians. And they said, what is Rawls talking about? If I'm behind the veil of ignorance, right? And imagine myself to be a devout Christian or Muslim, I would not choose liberty of speech, since in a world that I imagine there are novelists like Rushdie or Kazantzakis, right? Rushdie, who wrote a novel trashing Muslims' most cherished values and beliefs. Kazantzakis wrote a novel which he talked of Christ on the cross having homosexual fantasies and so on. Blasphemous stuff. He says, if I imagine behind the veil of ignorance that I'm a devout Muslim or Christian, I wouldn't choose free speech. I would choose something which would censor people like Rushdie and Kazantzakis. So if Rawls's instruction is, no matter what you imagine yourself to be behind the veil of ignorance, you will choose free speech, that's his claim, the protest by these philosophers and political theorists was, that's just false. If I imagine myself to be a devout Christian or Muslim, I wouldn't choose free speech. I would want to censor people who wrote blasphemous books, etc. And then Rawls replies to this in a famous reply, and he says, look, you would still choose liberty, even if you imagined yourself to be a devout Muslim or Christian behind the veil of ignorance. You would still choose free speech because you have general knowledge of people, even if you don't have knowledge of yourself, and you know as a general bit of wisdom about human psychology that people change their minds. So you would, even if you imagine yourself to be a devout Muslim or Christian or whatever, you would still choose free speech because you know, generally speaking, you know about people, that people change their minds. And one day you might change your mind and not be a Muslim or Christian. So free speech you choose because it will be an insurance policy for any future revised views you have. Because you have a general knowledge that people change their minds. So you will always choose free speech in order, even if you imagine yourself to be a devout Muslim, because you know someday you might change your mind. And if so, you would want to take out an insurance policy for your changed views, for your revised views. So this protest is obtuse. He's allowing general knowledge. That general knowledge has this bit of knowledge. And if you have this bit of knowledge, you will want to take out an insurance policy for your changed and revised values. So you would still choose free speech, even if you imagine yourself to be a Muslim or Christian. That's Rawls's argument. Right? This is crucial. You must remember that he's saying it's because of this and this that you would choose free speech. So keep that in mind. I'm going to return to it. All right. Now I'm going to switch to, so I've given you two philosophies in which they try and justify liberal values of freedom, in particular of free speech, by not appealing to any substantive values, general, universal things, anybody capable of reasoning, according to Mill and Rawls, according to their arguments, should believe in free speech, their arguments and methods, okay? That's the universalism. If people ask, why does liberalism have this universalism about it? This is the underlying claim of liberal thought. That's what makes for liberal universalism. Okay, now I'm going to switch to something I've written about quite a lot, and that is the concept of identity. The concept of identity is a very, very prevalent concept ever since the rise of identity politics. Muslim identity politics, Christian identity politics in this country, the country I'm domiciled in, is prevalent, Hindu identity politics, etc., etc. Now, what does it mean what is this concept of identity? Now, one way to think of the concept of identity is that the way I would characterize the concept of identity is, or the concept of my seeing myself in a certain way as having a certain identity, my identifying with certain things, which often mobilizes me in politics. So what is this concept of identity, such that I have an identification with something, Islam, Christianity, whatever, socialism, which mobilizes me into the political arena, mobilizes vast numbers in the political arena. Now, I think that identity should be characterized as follows. One's identity in politics, in the sense of identity politics, is, one way to understand it is to say that I've got some very deep commitments to Islam, Christianity, socialism, whatever it might be. I have very deep commitments, and those commitments constitute my identity. And not all of them have to be political. So for instance, I give the example in one of my essays called What is the Will, in which I have a very, very deep commitment to friendship. And one day, one of my closest friend actually in Oxford was a very serious drug dealer. And so I give the example of how when the police came, and I used to think my friend was a horrible person. He was ruining the lives of many of our Oxford friends by giving them very serious drugs. I don't mean just pot, I mean really serious drugs. And this was in the 70s. And he was making an enormous amount of money as a drug dealer. And he was my closest friend. And one day the police came and said, look, we have some suspicions about this. Can you, if you tell us there's anything to our suspicion. And I used to quarrel with him all the time, saying he was immoral and so on. But when the police came, I just said, I don't know what you're talking about. That means I was so deeply committed to friendship that even though I thought my friend was completely immoral, I could not tell the police what they wanted to hear. So when you have deep commitments of this kind, it could be to friendship, it could be to Islam, it could be to anything that you have deep commitments to. What it means is that you can't imagine that it is you if you were to snitch on your friend. That's how deeply you're committed you are to friendship. You say, if I were to snitch on my friend, I wouldn't recognize who I am. That's what it means to have a certain identity. Right? That commitment to friendship is constitutive of who I conceive myself to be, such that if I didn't act on it, if I acted afoul of that commitment, I would say, what did I do? That's not me. Right? That's how deep a commitment, say, to friendship or to Islam and so on could be. Now, what is very interesting is that now I want to make this idea of deep self-conceptions of certain values, of commitments of mine, value commitments of mine to friendship, etc. I want to talk about it in the political sphere. So take somebody like Ayatollah Khomeini, Khomeini once said in a very important statement, look, modernity is very pernicious. It's going to spread like a contagion. He called it a contagion. And he said, it's even going to affect us in Iran, and it's going to affect us Ayatollahs. Modernity is so pervasive and spreads like a disease. He said, therefore, we must be so deeply committed to Islam that we must entrench Islam now, so that even if in the future we are seduced by modernity, we are living by Islam even when we are seduced. So let's entrench Islam in Iran, right? Let's entrench Islam so deeply. And this is part of the mission of the faqih, the fiqh was to say, entrench it, make it so deeply committed, the society and the polity so deeply committed to Islam, that even if in the future we were seduced by the developments of modernity that would no doubt affect Iran as well, we would still be living by it because we've entrenched it now. What I've called this in my work is identity in the form of holding commitments in the Ulysses and the Sirens form. Because what did Ulysses say? Ulysses said, I'm so deeply committed to my family, to fidelity, to the value of fidelity, to Penelope. I'm so deeply committed to it. I know that tomorrow, when the calypsos, when the sirens sing their song, when I'm wandering around in the calypsos, I know that I'll be seduced by the sirens. So I'm going to tie myself to the mast so that even when I'm seduced by the sirens and their songs, I'm not able to act on my seduced state. That's just what Khomeini is saying. He's committed to Islam in a Ulysses and the Sirens form, just as fidelity to Penelope, fidelity to Islam, these are the deep commitments. You commit yourself, you tie yourself to the mast. such that even if you're seduced by pernicious developments, you don't act on your seduced state, you act on the state you've entrenched, the values you've entrenched. That's how deep your commitment is to those values. That's the concept of identity. You can have shallow notions of identity, but this is the deep notion, the Ulysses and the Sirens form. And if you have values held in this Ulysses and the Sirens form, you have identity. So I can here's a slightly technical version of it. Don't be put off by the formulation. At time t1, I desire or value X. It could be Islam. In Khomeini's case, it was Islam. Or friendship in my case, or whatever. In such a way that if I thought I might cease to desire or value X at time tn, some future time, I would entrench things in such a way at t1 that at time tn, I would be living by value X, despite the fact that I would not value X at time tn. That's exactly what both Ulysses and Khomeini were saying. Right? This is what they were saying. Deep commitment to Islam, deep commitment to Penelope or fidelity. Right? These are identity constituting. Khomeini has Muslim identity, right? Family values constitute Ulysses' identity, etc. Okay. Now, notice the following simple thing. Rawls is telling us that we should believe in free speech. He says, behind the veil of ignorance, even if I imagine myself to be a devout Muslim, I would be committed to free speech because I know that I would one day change my mind. And so I should take out an insurance policy for my future states of revised states of the future states of mind. But the concept of identity in politics tells you that you should take out an insurance policy for your present views against the future changes of mind. So what I want to get across to you is that the mentality of liberalism, to stress, in Mill's case, to stress fallibility, we could be wrong. In Rawls' case, to stress revisability, we could always change our minds, goes against the very idea of commitment, of deep commitments, of identity constituting commitments. And that's why liberalism finds it so hard to cope with identity politics. It's got nothing to do with communitarianism. It's got to do with this moral psychology that liberalism is officially, in its claims that I tried to expound in both Mill and Rawls, stressing fallibility in Mill, stressing revisability. And commitment tells you revisability is a weakening. It's a seduction and a weakening. So your identity is characterized by your present commitments. You should take out an insurance policy for your present commitments against future weakenings. So the mentality of identity and the mentality of liberalism are antlers locked. That's why liberalism really can't cope with that. This is the deepest underlying difficulty that identity politics poses for liberalism. I think the communitarian protest is relatively shallow compared to this underlying mentality that is really what puts them at odds with one another. Okay, so that's the broadly philosophical point I wanted to make. Do I have about 10 or so minutes to talk about the current, some more topical issues on the basis of what I've said, or do you want to have a discussion? I don't want to speak endlessly, so you should, I think people might be more interested in actual political issues rather than the philosophy underlying them. So I'm entirely in your hands. I didn't want to give a completely arcane philosophical talk. I wanted to connect it with current issues and topical issues, but I leave it to you because I don't want to talk too much.
Professor Bilgrami, you can speak for another 15 minutes and then we can go to the discussion.
All right, okay, fine. So I want to say a couple of things. You see, it's of great interest to me that liberalism takes a certain attitude towards rights in the following sense. I think that for all the official stress in liberal political philosophy, as I've expounded it, on revisability, changing minds, how saying you could be wrong, we could be wrong, etc., that you find in Mill and Rawls. For all the official stress on fallibility and revisability, which is essential to liberalism in order to give it its universal foundations, as I've expanded it, the liberal concept of rights is precisely taking Khomeini's view. That is, the liberal concepts of fundamental rights is basically siding with Khomeini's thinking rather than with official liberal thinking found in Mill and Rawls. What do I mean by that? I mean that you can never understand what fundamental rights are unless you see them having the following property, the following outlook. Ask yourself, let's just stick with free speech. It is the most fundamental of all rights in any liberal constitution. You have certain built-in exceptions to free speech, right? More or less in terms of the harm principle. So you can't shout fire. You don't have the freedom of speech to shout fire in a crowded theater. And anything which causes serious harm, you can't do. So there are built-in constraints on the commitment to free speech, like built-in constraints to anything. There are built-in constraints to homicide laws, like self-defense, etc. So all laws have built-in constraints, but once the built-in constraints are there, and they are usually specified in the Constitution, free speech, things, certain constraints of security, etc., national security, etc., are built in. Once they're built in, ask yourself, with these built-in constraints, what makes free speech, which is a value, different from other values in that it gets erected into a fundamental constitutional principle or right, as a right, constitutional fundamental right. What's the difference between ordinary values and values that are elevated to this position of constitutional? So free speech is a value. You value free speech, I value free speech, Aishwarya Iyer values free speech, all of us value free speech. Right? But why? But we value many other things. So why does liberalism elevate this particular value of all the values we value and make it into a fundamental constitutional right? The answer is because it's thinking just like Khomeini. The idea is that if tomorrow somebody comes along and says some hateful propaganda, which some hateful racist propaganda or some, I will want to censor such a person. but according to, if it's a fundamental right, then my wanting to censor it will be like Ulysses being seduced by the sirens. So I tie myself to the mast of free speech as a fundamental constitutional right, so that even if some hateful person comes around and propagates all this horrible stuff, I say, censor the guy, but I can't act on that because I've tied myself to the mast of free speech by elevating free speech into a fundamental right. So the very idea of liberal fundamental rights goes against all the arguments that liberal philosophers give. They are, in fact, siding with Khomeini. Khomeini is just doing it with Islam and Islamic values. Liberals are doing it with free speech. But that's okay. That's just a difference in which values they value. But the structure of it is identitarian. Khomeini and the idea of fundamental rights are expressing the same mentality. Tie yourself to the mast. That's how deeply you're committed to non-interference of speech, in speech. That's how deeply he's committed to Islam. It's the same. So you have all this official stuff about revisability, but the concept of rights is precisely to put the brakes on revision by tying yourself to the mast. Okay? Now, I think that's fine. But you then can't criticize Khomeini. You and I value free speech. And we want to tie ourselves to the mast with it. And, but you can't make your prejudices against Islam come out to say that Khomeini's thinking just as clearly and just as rationally as liberals are thinking when they formulate fundamental rights. It's the same thinking. How can he be more irrational than you? Okay, now, here then is the next couple of things I want to say. And one of them is, why is it? Let's ask a question, which is surely on everybody's mind. Why is it that liberalism has never, ever put forward anything but non-interference and similar things as a fundamental constitutional right? Right? Why aren't economic rights got the same status? The right to work. Right? Rega talks about rights, but it's basically a policy. It's a policy that was very, very fitfully implemented. First of all, it was a policy that was adopted with a lot of pressure from one wing of the Congress Party against the economic advisors around Manmohan Singh, but it was Sonia Gandhi's wing of the party which moved on it. Wasn't popular with the entourage of economic advisors around Manmohan Singh. And of course, UPA 1 had depended a lot on the left parties too, which were keen on Rega, but it was never elevated like free speech and freedom of religion, etc. So economic rights are always more policy than right. The word right is not strictly speaking correct for economic rights, and it's never been. So one day I asked Ronald Dworkin, who he and I were part of a seminar at NYU, actually, myself. And I asked him why this is so. And he said, liberalism has always insisted that nothing can be a right unless it is implementable by the state. And he says, unless its implementation can be guaranteed by the state. And he says, since liberalism almost always accompanies capitalism, and capitalism necessarily depends on a certain level of unemployment, right? You cannot make the right to employment a fundamental right, because in liberalism, the only thing that can count as a fundamental right is something that the state is guaranteed to implement. It can't implement. It can't guarantee the implementation. So it can at best be a very firm commitment of policy, but not a right. Only those things are right that you can guarantee. So the British state spent literally millions of pounds guaranteeing Salman Rushdie's freedom of speech for something like 12 years. They gave him police protection every single day. I mean, it was in free speech is, you guarantee it. You can't guarantee full employment. So that is why you can't have. Okay, so let's take liberalism at its face value. The most prominent legal jurist, Ronald Dworkin of liberalism, has said that this is the grounds for why there are no economic rights. Liberalism requires something to be a right, properly so-called a right, only if the state can guarantee its implementation. It can't guarantee full employment. No state can guarantee, no capitalist state can guarantee. Okay. Now, let's call that bluff. Okay, so only if something is guaranteed to be implemented is it a right. Okay, so now this regime in India of the last 6 years has brazenly not implemented the right to free speech. Brazenly. Okay, but let's call Ronald Dworkin and the liberals bluff. See, there's a great temptation to say the Indian state has got an impeccable set of legislative commitments and constitutional commitments. It's just the actual Indian state today is not implementing them. I'm sorry, you can't say what you say about economic rights and then say that you're a liberal state and it's failing to be implemented. If you're failing to implement it, you're not a liberal state. Because that's what you've said about economic rights. You said you've got to guarantee its implications, that's why this can't be a right. But you can't have it both ways. If you can't guarantee free speech, as you manifestly have not in the last 6 years, then you are an illiberal state. You're not a state which is basically liberal, but you have a government that is not fulfilling it. By being consistent with what you've said about economic rights, you're not a liberal state. India is not a liberal state today. This is just carrying through the logic of what they say about economic rights. The usual view is, we've got a great constitution, we're just not implementing it. No. The constitution is not what it is, because remember, the rights have to be, it's only a right if it's guaranteed implementation. That's what you've said to rule out economic rights. Well, it just shows that you can't say impeccable legislation, failure of executive branch. No, it's just that there is no legislative constitutional liberal state in India. That just follows from what you've said about ruling out economic rights. Okay, that's one point, right? Second, I want to end by saying that the reason why it's so important to have economic rights as a right in the Ulysses and the Sirens form that I've been presenting it. The reason why it's so important to have economic rights is, and this is not just in India, but everywhere in the world, not just have employment-inducing policies, such as, say, Keynesian policies, right? Demand management, creating employment in the way that Keynes proposed as a policy. But the reason why it's very important to elevate it into a Ulysses and the Sirens, tying yourself to the mast commitment, is because of one feature of capitalism that has become more and more evident in the last half century. And that is that everywhere, even in the Scandinavian belt of capitalism, which is where it's slightly less brazen, but it's even happening there, everywhere where you have policies, say basically Keynesian policies, they get dismantled. They're constantly under threat. They're constantly being undermined. Even in Scandinavia, and certainly in the main belt of capitalism, which is Western Europe, United States, Australia, Canada, etc. That is, a government comes along, it imposes social democratic constraints, basically Keynesian constraints, right, to try and provide for redistribution and employment, which is through demand management. Next government comes along and undermines it. There's no stability to economic policies that are redistributed and whichever. So nothing short of elevating them into tying yourself to the mast kind of status will stop this constant undermining that is built into the nature of capitalism. Look, you had Keynesian constraints for 30 years at least after the Second World War in most of the Europe and the temperate belt of capitalism, right? Well, temperate belt, United States. Colonialism's diffused capital to these other parts of the world, like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, even, and certainly the United States. All of these states constantly are undermining policies of employment and housing and education, free education, housing, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So nothing short of making them, elevating them into a Ulysses and the Sirens style commitment will suffice. Nothing short of that will suffice, because it's built into the nature of capital that it will not tolerate constraints on itself for very long. So in the mid-70s, with the remantling of the Bretton Woods institutions, suddenly there was all the constraints, Keynesian constraints on capital had to be, many of them had to be put aside, because once you had runaway mobility of capital, as you did after the Bretton Woods institutions were transformed, the fear of capital flight makes it impossible to pursue constraints on capital, because capital will fly out of the country at the press of a button. And that was an effect of those changes in the 70s. So what I was describing as a Ulysses and the Sirens commitment, style commitment, which is the essence of rights, if it is extended to economic, what are merely economic policies, if they're elevated into stages, this constant undermining that is built into capital, it's the only way to fight it. Nobody's going to make a revolution. That's all just tiresome, romantic nonsense. So if you're looking for other ways to to combat this constant undermining in capitalism of constraints that are placed upon it, only something like the notion of rights is going to do it. And that notion of rights is what I'm calling the Ulysses in Silence. And the concept of rights and the concept of identity are the same concept. It's just liberal identity. It's one among other identities, like Islamic identity and other things. And there's nothing special about it. And if you want to have fair economic policies, there's no way you can resist the undermining of them constantly that's built into capitalism unless you make them into fundamental rights. Okay, I'm going to stop now.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bilgrami, for such a fascinating lecture. I don't think I'm going to sum up anything. I'm not a chair here. Just that it was so interesting to hear about this conflict between enabling values and substantive values that you talk about, and how the question of rights are very often are actually questions of substantive values. As you said, there's no difference between the Khomeini's idea of identity, Islamic identity, and probably even the idea of capital as such, the way we understand today, because both of them rely on certain substantive values to flourish, if I got it right. And it's so fascinating that you started with the concept of identity, and then you ended actually on the question of economic rights. I mean, I never thought these two could be related in any ways. And you also showed how both of these somewhere operate on the notion of implementability, but at the same time, both of them can work only when we have put some amount of restrictions on them, if we want to make them work at all in the kind of societies we live in at the moment. So thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I now open it up for the floor. If you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Typing sometime in the chat box doesn't really work. There seem to be many questions. Sometimes we seem to lose them. So if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, that'll be great.
Can I have a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. It's really fascinating. It's almost a class lecture, which is nice. And I have been teaching political theory in the last 8 years. And this is very fascinating, how you actually quite mingle both rights and identity. And this is something which is really provoking to a different direction. My simple query is that, of course, today the world has moved so far right that even Rawls becomes more radical. And you see recently Thomas Piketty in his new book, Capital and Ideology, he seems to be actually more relying on Rawls to argue for a participatory socialism. Now, I agree with you on this point of the liberty principle of Rawls and how that can be also equivalent to what Khomeini's position. But as we know that the difference principle of Rawls, and particularly with the revised edition of Rawls' A Theory of Justice, even the difference principle has two clauses. So one is that how social and economic inequalities must be arranged in such a manner that the most disadvantaged will be benefited. And number two is that office and positions must be open to all under fair principle of equality of opportunity. Mm-hmm. Now, it seems that the second principle of Rawls has some strong element of what you called economic rights, or in the fashionable terminology of political philosophy, the question of distributive justice. So I was quite wondering that even if we agree that we want to reform capitalism, and since a kind of a transcending capitalism is something which is not happening, so at least the difference principle is still there, and we can actually deepen that particular difference principle in order to ensure economic rights. So that's number one.
No,
and my
but let me answer one question at a time.
Okay.
I don't see how the difference principle amounts to a notion of rights, because all the difference principle says is that inequalities are tolerable if they make the worse off better. Right. That's the point of the difference principle, and so the difference. I mean, I was focused on liberty. I was focused on the first principle and not the second principle. But the second principle doesn't give you any notion of rights. It just says you should be free to pursue policies of equality, and the only time that inequalities should be allowed is if they help the worse off in society, right? So in fact, I actually find there's certain elements of the difference principle which I find completely distasteful. So, so one element of the difference principle is, suppose Maidul Islam is a man of tremendous talent, right? And I say, give him $1 trillion because he's so talented. And he will come up with some invention which will tremendously increase growth, right? So suppose you're living in the 70s, and you say, this guy is so talented, just give him way more money to incentivize him to come up with something like informational technology. You know, take the Turing computer and make it into the digital computer that everyone can use, and it will make the economy grow. And then there will be a trickle down from it, and you will, the worst off will improve as a result of it. You know, you will have outsourcing in Bangalore and Hyderabad and things like that. All this will come from incentivizing Maidul's talent as a computer scientist, etc., to do this. And so give him way more than, or give, you know, the same thing was said by the investment bankers, right? Remember, when the financial crisis happened, and there was a widespread popular protest, and they said, get rid of these damned investment executive bankers. They're making millions in their bonuses and so on, and they've created this crisis. Get rid of them. And all of the banking establishment said, no, but if you take away their bonuses and the huge salaries, you will lose all the talent. The only answer to that was, if the talent created the crisis, let's have some damn mediocrity in investment banking. Right? So there is a whole way of thinking about incentivizing and trickle down and all, which is built into the difference principle. And I think that's a very much part of Rawls's refusal to think of, you know, building in rights, economic rights and so on, but rather saying, keep the policies going. Of course, Rawls is an egalitarian, he would like to happen, but he's not taking the radical step of making them rights, not at all. In fact, that's the whole point of the difference principle. It can't be developed along the lines you're suggesting.
Maidul, would you like to ask your second question?
Yeah, just very briefly, very briefly. Yeah, you see, Akeel, I agree with you, and so just as provoking. One thing I think the problem with normative political philosophy and the kind of argument that you're making is that they don't take hegemony seriously. So what was Khomeini doing was essentially what would somebody from the left, somebody like Gramsci onwards, Gramsci to Laclau, would say that basically it's a hegemonic move. You see, and what's the shift from the UPA kind of rights, you know, at least not rights, but then the policy of addressing a distributive justice question through MREGA to the Modi kind of regime is a certain kind of an actual real politics happening on the ground, and to pursue a population to argue for a case that, okay, this is something which is a right thing, or this is something which is just society. What liberalism and Khomeini, or in any case the Hindutva brigade, they do that. They have an idea of just society, which is the Hindu Rashtra, or in Khomeini's case the Vilayat-e-Faqih, or in liberalism it's the, in Rawlsian case is the property owning democracy. But how do you actually make that? And you will never make that, because that's an elusive idea, that there's an idea of building something, but then you always you always become short of that, achieving that goal. But in between, there is this contestation between very different sectors of the population, and the very idea of hegemony is something which is not taken seriously by political philosophers.
Right. Well, I agree with that. I mean, the thing about the idea of hegemony in Gramsci, in case others aren't completely familiar with it, it's you see, hegemony doesn't just mean total control. That total control is too blunt or flat-footed a description. I mean, we use the word hegemony to mean total control in our loose and common way of speaking, quotidian way of speaking. But in Gramsci, hegemony means something very specific. And Gramsci, hegemony means that the ruling class or the ruling government, I mean, he was interested in class, but you could say whoever the rulers are, and for him it was always a class because he was a Marxist, the ruling class gets to be the ruling class by convincing all other classes that its interests are the interests of all other classes. Yeah. That's the definition of Gramscian hegemony. That the ruling class gets to be the ruling class by convincing all other classes that its interests are the interests of all other classes. Right? And what is interesting is that if Gramsci's analysis of capitalism is that in capitalist societies, which are liberal, I mean, China is a capitalist society, which is not liberal, but in capitalist societies which are liberal, there is always hegemony. That's why they don't have to be authoritarian, they can be liberal. Mm-hmm. Right? So you can have authoritarianism where you make people do things, right? But in capitalist liberal societies, you don't make people do things, you get them to consent to your privilege, because your privilege will be their privilege too, according to what they're convinced by, right? That's when you have hegemony. You don't need to be authoritarian. If you've convinced them that your interests are their interests, you don't have to impose authoritarian policies on them. Right? That was Gramsci's idea. And he says this is a hallmark of capitalist liberal societies. So they don't have to be like the Soviet Union, etc., where they force you to do things. They do it by other means. And this is absolutely correct. I mean, as an analysis, it's absolutely correct. I mean, because, I mean, you just look at the United States. There's everybody in the United States wants a single payer system, except a very small fragment of the corporate sector and a bunch of greedy, grasping doctors. Right? It's just the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and a bunch of money-grubbing private doctors. Right? And there's some multipliers around insurance and pharmaceuticals, but it's still no more than, look, let's be generous. Maybe it's something like 75 to 80% of the corporate sector. That's surely a very generous. Now, but the rest of the corporations are groaning under healthcare costs. Right? So it's not just ordinary people who want a single payer system, a national health service. It's most of the corporations and it doesn't happen. Right? Why? Because there's a general consensus which has been shaped by the media, by education. This is just an ideological, it's what Marx and Foucault call ideology. Foucault called it discipline or disciplinarity and so on, but that's the idea. So hegemony works in these ways. You know, you've got the press behind you, you've got the whole political zeitgeist, right? The whole political culture is such that what the ruling class ideology is, it's just consented to by the rest of the classes. Right? So you don't need the ruling class to be authoritarian. That's the idea.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. Next, we'll go to
Hi,
Pallavi. Oh, sorry, Moise. Would you like?
Yes,
okay,
Pallavi can go first if she wants.
Oh, because you know they are raising hands, but Moise, you can go first, and then we'll go to Pallavi. Please go ahead. But I'll request everyone to keep their questions brief so that we have more time for discussion. Yeah.
Okay. But let's have some gender distribution.
Because the next three all are women, actually. Next three, those who have raised their hands. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Professor Bilgrami. Two questions. One.
That doesn't sound like a very feminine voice.
No, Moise is not a woman, but the next three, those who are going to ask questions are going to be all women. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Professor Bilgrami, for a really generative talk. I have two questions. One is India and liberalism, and the other would be on Islam. So coming to India first, my thesis would be to say that actually it's not a good starting point to begin with the premise that India is a liberal constitution, and then, critiquing the lack of liberality and, so many of these reasonable or unreasonable restrictions in rights. And I say that because the negative liberty tradition has not been a very strong one. For various reasons, because rather than this liberal project of associated with the state and law, I would say that more central in India has been anti-statist and anti-legalist, projects of subjectivity and sovereignty centered around the self. So, I remember when you wrote about Gandhi the philosopher, the contrast was not only with liberal theory, but also with Kant. And Kant, as we know, is talking about the categorical imperative. That
it's a what? Kant is
talking about the categorical imperative. But at the same time, if you read Isaiah Berlin in the Two Concepts of Liberty, he says that Kant is just two steps away from German romantic nationalism of Fichte. And
he's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yes, and the reason for that is that Kant is centered around the self, right? At the end of the day, and self-realization, self-determination, freedom from self-tutelage, and so on. So he's concerned with the question of selfhood, which liberal theory is not really invested in. And when you talked about Gandhi, you contrasted him with Kant, and Kant's in contrast to the categorical imperative of Kant, the exemplarity that Gandhi kind of espoused. So I just wanted to see what you would have to say with regards to the relationship of liberalism and selfhood as far as India is concerned. And the second question is with regards to Islam. I really like the equation that you drew between rights and identities. And I would also quote Ghalib and say that, the famous line where he says that Khuda ke vaste Kabe pe se parda na utha Zahid, kya pata wahan kahin aisa na ho ke wahan bhi kafir sanam nikle. Right? So in that sense, both liberalism and Islam are, they are concerned. I bring this up over here because you talked about entrenchment. And this Islam is also deeply anxious in its modern garb, has been deeply anxious about commodity fetishism. And with capitalism, Islam does not want this commodity fetishism, and yet it requires commodity fetishism to actually, circulate throughout the world. But so that would be the parallel. But coming to Iran, just one final bit that it's not necessarily.
Moise,
Yes.
if I could just intervene,
Yes.
could you please get to the
just
question?
one more line.
Please.
Yes, just one more line. In Iran, you talked about entrenchment and Islam being entrenched and the similarities with liberalism. But, I would also read Khomeini as making a case actually for sovereignty in Islamic imaginary. And it's not so much about, of course, there might be entrenchment that Islam needs to be entrenched, but it's also about maslaha. If maslaha so demands, the Ayatollah has the power to basically, suspend the Sharia law, right? So, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the relationship between liberalism and sovereignty in Islam.
Well, but that's just saying that, this is in a way, it's a bit like Carl Schmitt, right, who says that philosophies of this kind, even liberalism, deconstructs itself, because it can have all the constitutions you like, but then that sovereignty lies in the capacity to declare the exception, right? So the emergency or whatever, that's where the real sovereignty lies. Whoever gets to declare the exception, that's really all that Khomeini is saying when he says that I can lift the entrenchment, or the council can lift the entrenchment, etc. But that's just Carl Schmitt's idea of declaring the exception. That's not you can't confuse the exception with the rule. But on the matter of Kant, it's you see, what you've got to understand, what Isaiah Berlin was saying is, basically you've got to understand, Isaiah Berlin was a Cold Warrior. He was anxious to show that a certain version of rationality that lies with the idea of the rational self, which must realize itself, govern itself, etc. A certain version of it would lead to a Leninist, vanguardist conception that a party, he had in mind the Bolsheviks, after all he was displaced from Russia, that a party knows the forward movement of history and can therefore know what the people really want, right? So it can say, this is the revolutionary self of the ordinary Russian peasant and worker, right? The party knows what the real self is, and it's going to realize the revolutionary self of every proletarian and peasant in the Soviet Union. That's what made him anxious. And the reason why he says Kant is got the potential for being developed along those lines is that, unlike Hume, Kant did not think that rationality consists in what I have somewhere, and Bernard Williams and so on have called internal reasoning, right? Internal reasoning is the idea that each person reasons from their wants and values and desires, and there is no objective external reason. And Kant's categorical imperative was committed to an external reason which sometimes goes against one's internal desires and values and so on and so forth. So since negative liberty is very much tied to internal, what Williams calls internal rationality, the very idea of Kant's external reasoning or categorical imperative has the potential to be taken along Bolshevik, Leninist, whatever lines, and there's a trajectory from, even Popper realized this, from Plato, Hegel, Rousseau really, Hegel to Kant, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel to Marx. And that's what goes against negative liberty. And external reason or categorical imperatives are an undermining of internal, I mean, a repudiation of internal reasoning. That's what's at stake.
Thank you. Can we go to Pallavi next? Pallavi.
Yeah, thank you, Musarraf. So, Professor Bilgrami, I would first of all like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. I've already typed my question. I'll just explain it. So, what I understood was that you felt that roles and identity politics converge if we elevate free speech to a fundamental right. But I was wondering that don't the two converge even if we do not elevate free speech to a fundamental right? So I've written that Rawls tells us to believe in free speech in the present and future, which is an insurance policy against future changes of mind. Identity politics tells us to believe...
No, Pallavi. It's an insurance policy not against future changes of mind, but in favor of future states of mind.
Okay, yeah, sure. So probably I use the wrong language. So basically the idea is that if I believe in free speech, then it allows me the freedom to change my mind in the future. That's the idea. Now, identity politics tells us that if I believe in my present commitment, like you said, let's entrench Islam or XYZ. So if I believe in my present commitment, then it'll allow me not to wander away in the future. Right? So aren't we doing this that we want to believe in something in the present so that we don't wander away in the future, irrespective of whether or not free speech is a fundamental right?
Yes, but I'm saying that that's the official view in people like Rawls and Mill, that you stress revisability, you stress, in Mill's case, it's fallibility. We could be wrong, right? So it's a very similar view. And for the identitarian, it's to stress commitment, right? And say any revising will be a weakening from the deep commitments we have. So that's the loggerhead of the two outlooks of liberalism and the identitarian. And then I said that when liberals then go on to talk about rights, they have defected from their official fallibility, revisability view and adopted the Khomeini view. So this is what postmodernists must mean by deconstruction, right? You say something which undermines the very official thing you've said.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bilgrami. Mansi, can we go next to you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture. It was very, very interesting to hear you, point out some of the tensions within the foundations of liberalism. The point where I slightly lost you, and I just want to ask a quick question, was with regard to when you started speaking about economic fundamental rights. And my question is, your critique of capitalism's failures are very well taken. But I think, the distortions you were speaking of, in my mind, especially the US elections being sort of, very much in the news cycle, I think these distortions are very, very obvious, with a populism both on the left and the right taking, finding some wins in their sails. But I was wondering if, why did you favor a creation of economic fundamental rights? I was wondering, why is it not your conclusion that instead it's, the governance structures that have really failed, that have become, opaque and elitist? They've lost sight of their constituents. So I just want to understand how economic fundamental rights would be a solution to the current jam we find ourselves in around the world.
So there were 2 points I made. The one point was that everybody, all my colleagues here at Columbia University, so including Joe Stiglitz, right, who's somebody I talk to a lot and I respect very much and so on, but there's nobody amongst my colleagues. And so that's just a sampling. If it's true of Joe Stiglitz, it's true of everybody, Amartya Sen, all the mainstream economists. Everybody says that the great problem is that gives rise to all this madness of Trump, and they think Brexit is madness, and all that is, all of this is come because, and they rightly point out, it comes from working class dissatisfaction as a result of the rolling back of social democracy, or rolling back of basically Keynesian constraints on capital that were placed ever since 1945. All that has gone. There's been just chronic wage stagnation since the 70s. There's been, Piketty's written a whole 700-page book describing how inequalities have mushroomed basically over a century. Fantastic. The best thing about the book is the volume of data. And all of that, right? Everybody agrees. Working class dissatisfaction, the deindustrialization of Midland and the North, and brought about the Brexit populism, the working class, white working class dissatisfaction brought about the Trump phenomenon. Everybody agrees to that. Okay, but nobody wants to say that the alternative cannot be the Clintonite Democratic Party of Obama and Biden and so on. Nobody wants to say that the Blairite Labour Party, and, all of these are responsible for bringing about the rolling back of social democracy. They declare Sanders to be unelectable, they declare Corbyn to be unelectable, right? What they want is to go back to the very thing that created this rolling back. Because remember, the rolling back happened in the late 70s, policies from the late 70s, which were enthusiastically developed by the Clintonite Democratic Party and the Blairite Labour Party. Basically, Blair's Labour Party divorced the Labour Party from Labour. Right? All it was Labour with a capital L. Labour with a small l has nothing to do with the Labour Party ever since Blair. And so the point I'm making is that it's the function of liberalism, it's the function of a whole range of politics that is allowed to dominate the political arena in capitalist societies, that they will never tolerate permanent constraints on labor. They will say, okay, you can have social democracy from 1945 to the late 70s, but then we will bring about a financialization, a global financialization of capital, where there will be runaway capital mobility. Anybody then trying to impose Keynesian constraints and social democratic policies will be risk capital flight from their country. So state intervention is immediately inhibited. That was a transformation in the late 70s, right? It's what made possible the emergence of Thatcher and Reagan, etc. So it's in the nature of capital to allow social democratic constraints and then undermine them. They never allow them to be stable and permanent. That's just the nature of the tendencies of capital. And what I'm saying is, the only way to fight that is to elevate into a Ulysses and Sirens-like commitment what are policies of the Keynesian kind. Right? Entrench them. And that can only be done by talking about those economic policies becoming rights. If you understand the nature of capital and its tendency to undermine constraints that are placed on it, even in Scandinavia, right, if you understand that that is an internal trajectory and tendency of capital, allow social constraints, social democratic constraints, undermine them. Allow them, undermine them. This is just the history of, just look at the history of 20th century capitalism. And this is constantly happening, right? No equilibrium for the constraints. I'm saying You want equilibrium from the constraints, you just have to take a Ulysses and Sirens-like stance on the economic policies, make them into rights. Okay? That's one point I made. The other point I made is to say that since liberalism does not want economic rights because it says no liberal capitalist society can guarantee its implementation, right? They can guarantee free speech implementation, but they can't. So only free speech and things like that can be a right, not economic rights. Those are not properly called rights because it can't be guaranteed. Well, I'm saying if that is so, and you don't guarantee free speech as is happening in India, then you are an illiberal state. You're not just got some impeccable constitution and this government is not living up to it. You're an illiberal state. That follows from what you've said about economic rights. Yeah, Ravi?
Thank you, Akeel. That was absolutely fascinating and I enjoyed every minute of it. My question comes from a scientific point of view. The theory of skepticism that reality cannot be determined 100%.
What can't be determined?
Reality.
Strategy.
Reality.
Reality.
Yes. Reality cannot be determined 100%. There are problems with perceiving reality. Heisenberg's principle, you see the position, you can't decide the velocity, and so on. The principle of entropy. Things are always changing and in flux. Therefore, there can never be any certainty in any system. It may be approximating somewhere, it may be going towards somewhere, but it never quite reaches it. The word you used, equilibrium, is a desirable state, but one that is never achieved. So if one applies this principle, you might say that what we want to do is perhaps achieve that state which has the least evil and the most good. From that point of view, maybe the Scandinavian situation, whilst having some deficiencies, is kind to move towards that Heisenbergian position. You've almost found where the particle is, not quite, but you're willing to pay that price to be there. I just want your reaction to this kind of thing.
Well, but you know, there's no stability in equilibrium, even in Scandinavia. But one of the things we have to understand is that Scandinavia is a peripheral belt of capitalism. It's not the main belt of capital. Right? Well, the pressures on the main belt of capital are very different from what is there in the periphery. But even in Scandinavia, there is an enormous amount of rolling back on a very wide range of commitments. And Norway is almost unique because Norway has its own oil, right? It didn't even need to join the European Union because it's just got that one commodity that that allows it to be pretty much do whatever it wants, just given the global demand for it. So if you put Norway aside, I believe that if you look carefully at a whole range of the rest of the Scandinavian belt, there is constant pressure to undermine its social democratic policies. And governments come, they undermine it, the next government tries to restore some of it, and so on. But in any case, I would say that so it's not an exception really to what I'm saying. It's just that the tendencies that I was describing are much more powerfully felt are much more palpably felt in the main belt of capitalism, which is Western, not Northern Europe, but Western Europe, and its diffusionary spread to the United States, and which is the main partner. And I would also add that that Western, you know, I mean, there's a differentiations within what I'm saying. So Anglo-American capital is the most brazen and shameless, right? There's just no doubt about it. In fact, Anglo-American capital describes Germany, its working class, as pampered. Openly says it's pampered working class, right? You know, there are too many vacations and things like that. And basically all this constant push against NATO's pushing against the Russian borders and so on is basically because they want a form of labor that is not pampered for capital, which they think Western Europe has. And that's really what's going behind, but what lies behind the NATO's constant harassment of on the borders of you know, the whole region of Crimea. And so on. I'm not an admirer of Russia by any means, but I'm just saying that this is just the way that capital goes, and it's just a rivalry. And you know, there's no doubt that there's competition between the Western European capital and what it's anxious about by the capital of the Northeast, of Japan, China, and so on, right? There's just that's one set of rivals and so on. So there's just tremendous rivalry. If you like to, and you know, with China spreading into Africa and so on, you would know more about this than I do. There's a kind of inter-imperial rivalry now between these countries. So there's no equilibrium whatsoever. And the only reason why the Scandinavian countries have some immunity from what I'm calling this tendency is that they are a relatively a differentiated belt and not part of this rivalry. In Norway's case, because it has that one commodity, but in the other cases, wherever it doesn't have that kind of privilege that Norway has, it is undermined. There is no equilibrium in Scandinavia apart from in Norway, and you know, not just on the economic front. I mean, in Denmark and so on, there's this tremendous anxiety about refugees, about multiculturalism and things like that. You know, so all of this is catching up there too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. I know it's going on for 2 hours now, but do you think you can take questions from another 5 members of the audience? I mean, I can see there are 5 people who want to ask questions. Is it possible?
It's fine. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Okay. Next, Aishwarya, please go ahead.
Thanks, Musharraf. Thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami, for your very interesting lecture. I belong to the discipline of literature, so I guess my comments and questions are going to be rather elementary because they'll be focused on words and meanings and you know, that kind of I'm not able to think of the word, you know, internal critique. So for instance, I'm just referring to, you know, the premises that you put out there by John Stuart Mill. And the first premise there, when he talks about we held many true beliefs in the past, which we now know to be false. And I was just thinking that in this process of reasoning, he actually makes use of belief in order to actually reason to a certain conclusion. And then, you know, I was just wondering what exactly do we mean by belief in, you know, in this context, because we're then also speaking about Islam and we're referring to a certain kind of belief there. And there's, you know, are these the same belief or are they different beliefs, right? And the second question is, I mean, maybe I'm just thick, but I don't understand what it means to have a true belief and a false belief. And, you know, what exactly is the process of falsification? Does that require, I mean, does that, you know, what kind of personhood does it require to sort of, you know, that enables the falsification of previously held beliefs? So, you know,
those are very deep questions, Aishwarya. And I should have been, you know, I mean, I was speaking a little broadly when I used the word beliefs, but I could have easily said values and so on too, or just more generally sort of commitments. You're quite right that the word belief was doing a sort of omnibus work there, and it hid many different kinds of states of mind than beliefs, because beliefs are cognitive states, but it could be values, desires, wants, commitments. You know, so for instance, let's take something. So the example I gave was very much a cognitive belief, right? A scientific belief. I gave the example of the belief that the earth is flat, right? And I said, we now can't believe that. We believe that to be false, right? So that's an example. But you're absolutely right that you can't restrict yourself to that kind of belief. But let's take the belief in, let's say in Europe. Let's take you could say the belief that slavery is something we should have. Right? You can substitute for the word belief. We don't value slavery anymore. We're not committed to slavery anymore. So I'm happy to have a very wide use of mental terms like commitment, value, wants, preferences, as well as beliefs. So you can have very scientific, narrow sense of belief like the earth is flat. You can have much more value-oriented beliefs like, you know, in slavery and things like that. Now, if you ask most Europeans, I would say pretty much 100% of them would say, we don't value slavery anymore. Right? So that's an example of we had values in the past which we now think are wrong to have had. So I mean it to be as general as that. Right? It doesn't have to be just scientific beliefs. Mill was very interested in science. You know, he really was very interested in intellectual freedom, academic freedom, and he thought, he thought unless intellectuals are allowed to think, you wouldn't get progress in science and so on. This is a very widespread view. Karl Popper held it, and and it's a very standard liberal view that. But you're absolutely right. One shouldn't just talk about intellectual inquiry and freedom of intellectual inquiry. We should talk about values like slavery and all the rest of it. We used to have various values. We don't have them anymore. I wish we could say that of caste. But I can't say that of caste. But I think you can. I mean, it would surely be completely wrong to say that Europe still believes in slavery or still values slavery in the way that Hinduism still values caste. Right? It's just it's not like that. So we do give up past commitments, even value commitments.
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification. The second question was actually about, while we are, talking about identity, it's a kind of a mirror image of.
Aishwarya, you have some connectivity issues, so.
Really sorry. Maybe can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was just saying that since identity functions as a mirror image of because you talked about the image of Ulysses the Sultans, and both those who are holding on to identity. Can you hear me?
Aishwarya, can you come back a little later, because we still have connectivity issues with your connection, okay? So we can come back to your question. We'll go to Jadumani next. Jadu?
Yes, thank you, Musharraf, and thank you, Professor Akeel Bilgrami. As a student of political philosophy, I have been reading and listening you. I was a student in Hyderabad University. I have attended few of your talk. So, and I was waiting this moment to actually raise my question. So I will begin the question from the last question, that actually in the last question you were answering about the caste. So I'll go to the caste question as far as the right and good is concerned. And you very rightly, in a way, trying to problematize the issue of liberalism, the philosophy of liberalism. So I would directly go to the roles and the rights and the good. And he says that rights are prior to goods. He problematizes it. And when he talks about the rights, actually, there is another, philosophy. It is, linked with this idea of rights, the idea of discourse, which goes back to John Locke. And you are actually trying to also problematize the current liberalism, how the discourse on right actually taken by these the capitalist or the new liberals. And in the name of democracy, I would say, in the name of rights, actually, they are defending their economic rights. In a way, in that way, actually, it has created so much inequality. This is one problem that actually arises from this. And the second thing is that I would specifically like to ask that as far as the rights and good discourse are concerned, the communitarian and the rights of the liberal, how are you going to understand the caste question in India? Because caste question in India is about the rights, is about the good. In one way, they actually have the privilege, they actually have entitled to defend their rights, the upper caste. Because by birth, they actually have the every entitlement of rights to actually oppress the rest of the communities. At the same time, caste is not merely as a rights, also it is understood and defended as a component of the traditional good, which goes back to the communitarian idea. So how are you going to actually explain this? But your last answer was, something. It is. I didn't get it. So do you like to have any thought on this, rights versus good as far as the caste question in India, because it is both rights and good. And yeah, this is what I would like to ask. Thank you.
Well, let's speak about caste. I mean, the Rawls stuff is pretty arcane, and the distinction between the right and the good is got more or less overlap with what I was describing in the first and second half of the slogan. But let's talk about caste and legislation and rights. You see, there can be no denying that Ambedkar broke his lion's heart when he fought for decades for a form of legislative affirmative action, right? Legislatively entrenched affirmative action on the caste issues, and realize that it doesn't help. Of course, it's necessary. Nobody can deny that the kind of legislation that he demanded and got to a considerable extent, it's necessary. But even Ambedkar admitted at the end of his life that it was not sufficient. I don't think there's any way to understand the defection to Buddhism. He recognized that for all his decades of valiant, noble, insightful, brilliant legislative efforts, it didn't suffice. I believe that's equally true of race in this country where I'm domiciled. Right? Racism has been legislated out after the civil rights of the Johnson period. But racism is everywhere, as you know. Look, even liberals, even the best intentioned liberals, right, absolutely impeccable in their beliefs on race, they don't know how to behave with African Americans. They have no idea how to behave with them. I go to a seminar and the African American speaking, the white liberal will lean forward specially to listen to him or her. What is that? They just don't know how to behave. Right? They have impeccable views. It's a very deep thing. My own view is actually that it will never, ever go away unless there's intermarriage. That racism here will never, it's too deep. And so, it goes back to, you see, the reason why, for all the many mistakes that Gandhi made on caste, he did. He made terrible mistakes. He was obtuse about it. And, but what was he holding out for? I mean, if you want to be at all sympathetic, what was he holding out for? And his point always was, legislation is fine, it's necessary, but it will not suffice. Right? You cannot make human beings better just by making them into citizens. Right? The problem is too deep. So he made many mistakes in the jhagda that he had with Ambedkar on the nature of what the affirmative action and legislation should be, on separate electorates and so on. So those were obtuse mistakes. But I believe that by the end of his life, Ambedkar actually was implicitly conceding that this was. So when you ask, what about rights and so on, all I can say is that they're certainly necessary, but they're not sufficient. And one of the things you have to understand about caste is it's an amazingly, even when you have this affirmative action, you've got to understand that something is so complex that there's no easy answer to it. There's no single formulaic answer to it. So you see, it's really important to understand the following when it comes to caste. If you understand the history of legislation in the post-Second World War period all over the world, but let's look at liberal constitutions and liberal societies like India, South Africa, all of Europe, America, etc. See, one of the things you've got to understand is that after the Second World War, in Britain, it started in Britain. Actually, it had its antecedents in the New Deal in the United States. But in Britain, after the Second World War, with the Beveridge Report, what emerged was a culture of benefits, a political culture of benefits for working people, right? Housing, education, health, employment, etc. So this was just a political culture of benefits emerged with social democratic policies, first in the Beveridge Report, all over Europe immediately after. And when that happened, there was naturally a movement to say, but there are people who are badly off other than the working class. And so they began to first say, what about the physically disabled? Right? So then there were special benefits for the physically disabled. You had to have ramps going, and you had to have buses which came down like, all to the ground for wheelchairs to go in. So that was the first. But then people began to say, okay, but you have benefits for the working class, you have benefits for the physically disabled. What about the socially disabled? Right? And so then they said, all the historically depressed classes like African Americans and so on need special benefits. So that's how affirmative action. And Ambedkar was one of the early proponents. In fact, I would say he was a pioneer in affirmative action legislation. Okay. Now, with Mandal, this idea became very widespread because it was not just Dalits, but backward castes, etc. So then you had a whole mosaic of the political culture of benefits, right? Reaching out to, and that democratized politics tremendously in the 80s onwards. It was a fantastic democratization. You know, there are all these people who were against Mandel. They're disgusting, right? I mean, it was a tremendous democratization of power, right? People who did not have power in the past or any privilege got some power and privilege as a result of the changes of the 80s and that. Okay, now the question arises though, is once you have this completely deep and wide-ranging culture of benefits, then people feel that they better preserve caste in order to continue getting the benefits. Right? So then you have caste panchayats, etc., saying, look, we must keep the endogamy going because otherwise we lose the benefits if we get dispersed. Right? So no intermarriage, etc. So, you know, it's a very complex thing. It's a democratized, you know, amelioration for people who never had anything prior to getting some power, some benefits, etc. But then you perpetuate caste. So Ambedkar had two goals: the empowerment of caste and the annihilation of caste. Mandel, etc., made possible the empowerment of caste to a considerable extent. But it made that much more difficult, the annihilation of caste, because empowerment of caste led people to preserve caste endogamy in order to continue getting benefits. Whereas Ambedkar's view was, when you're empowered, you'll be able to then annihilate it. But it hasn't happened yet because of, so these are very complicated issues, right? It's not just a question of rights. It's a question of a whole political, social democratic development of democratization through benefits. You've got to study all that. It's not, you just can't repeat the word rights. It's a very complex phenomenon. Besides which, caste in Punjab is very different from caste in Maharashtra. You know, you can't study it all in a national form. You've got to study different regions differently.
Okay, thank you so much. I know it's going on for long now, but we have just 2-3 more people. We'll take those questions. And then very briefly, Vinod, could you please ask a question very briefly? Vinod is one of my colleagues here, along with Ashwarya, who teach English. Go ahead, Vinod.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Musharraf, and thank you very much, Professor Bilgrami. My question is that basically, so John Stuart Mill himself actually brings in the example of the Spanish church trying to ban all forms of worship, except of course its own. And he also very briefly mentions the question of food. He mentions pork, the Muslims not eating and Christians eating, and then of course the question of individual choice, etc., etc. Now, in the context of India, of course, it is beef. So my question to you is, what exactly is it that an authoritarian regime attempts to achieve when it basically bans something, and that it is attacking the liberal values is beyond doubt. But at the same time, there is also kind of an essentializing, illiberal, of course, and a very chauvinistic mode of defining the majority, and it's the majoritarian self and the minoritarian other was opposite to that. And I mean, like you also briefly mentioned the deconstructionist. I couldn't really get that point clearly. Is it in some sense that kind of essentialism that the deconstructionists are rebelling against, or what is your take on this first question about what exactly are they trying to achieve? Thank you very much.
Who's trying to achieve?
When the authoritarians, they try to impose ban on things, whether it is on food or clothes, is not there kind of an attempt to essentially define the majoritarian self in contrast to the minoritarian other?
Right. So no, you're absolutely right that Well, you know, there are different kinds. So if you take Kemalist Turkey, right? Kemalist Turkey was basically trying to wipe out a majoritarian Islamic culture, right? So it doesn't always, it isn't always, this kind of authoritarianism is not just felt by minorities. Kemalism in Turkey was very much attacking the majority culture, Islamic culture. And in general, I would say when that happens, I can put it down as the first law of Islamic politics, that if you suppress Islam especially in a majoritarian Islamic country, if you suppress Islam and then you lift the suppression and have elections, the Islamist parties will come into power. I can present that as a first law of Islamic politics, that it will always happen. It happened in Algeria, it happened in Egypt, it happened in Tunisia. It's just going to happen. You suppress it, and I mean, of course, the military stepped into Algeria, and there are these mad dog secularists who responded. But you can expect that to happen. Whereas in Pakistan, you haven't suppressed Islam. The Islamist parties don't get very many, very small percentage of votes. I mean, there can be a lot of jihadi stuff going on, but in democratic politics, they don't get anywhere if you tolerate Islam. Right? But if you suppress Islam and then you have democratic politics, they will always win the elections. Right? The Islamist parties will always win elections. Now, it's a very different set of issues when it comes to minority cultures and bans and suppression and so on and so forth. Yeah, you're absolutely right that when you have majoritarian nationalisms of the kind that you see in India today, the authoritarianism is very much like what it is in Germany, right? It's going after the minorities, and in fact, Bolsonaro's nationalism in nationalist populism in Brazil is akin, because he speaks with complete racist contempt of Afro-Brazilians, right? In the way that Muslims are. And he says, take away their citizenship and things like that. And there's much less of that in Erdogan's Turkey, though the Kurds are, but Kurds have always been suppressed. I mean, the Turks were much more brutal towards the Kurds than Saddam Hussein ever was. And you should know that the United States has never said a word against Turkish oppression of Kurds. So it's a very different case in the minority. It's just a standard way of, I mean, European nationalism was built on this kind of majoritarianism and of Protestants and Catholics in the respective majority populations suppressing the minorities, etc. Just look at what Britain did to the Irish. Just look at what Cromwell did to the Irish way back in the middle of the 17th century. So this has a very long history, and it's really part of the history of nationalism, and it ought to be distinguished from the majority suppressions. But those are there. You can't deny that those are there. That's why you can't compare laicity in France with because laicity is attacking the Maghrebi immigrant now, whereas in Ataturk there was no minority-majority thing. It was the majority.
Thank you. Ms. Munshi, if you could ask your question quickly, and then we have Prabhakar. And then if you have time at all, then we'll get back to Asher, yeah, to wrap up. Looks like Ms. Munshi is
Yes.
Oh, you are here. Okay. Sorry, you're muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for this very illuminating lecture. I have a very simple and a brief question to ask. See, when the liberal state is becoming rapidly authoritarian, I'm talking about India in particular just now, and contemporary India. So this is becoming authoritarian. Capitalism is more deeply entrenched now than ever before, marginalizing large sections of the population for whom, I mean, economic rights are really far from their lived reality of even securing a dignified existence. In the meanwhile, socialism is a thing of the past. Our own left and even radical left has been quite ineffectual. I mean, what options are really there? What options are there? It's very sad, but it's like we are now chasing after protecting even these very restricted, fragile rights, so-called rights that we have enjoyed. That's all, Professor Bilgrami.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I agree with you, Professor Munshi. You know, part of the trouble is, there are two things to say here. So certainly the left has been decimated everywhere. And, you know, it had a slight spike for about a decade or so in Latin America, in countries like Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, and so on. Very impressive in its way. But that too has been, as I said, it's a tendency of anybody who's caught up in the global finance system, finance capital system, to have these things undermined. One of the things I don't understand, and this is, I'm truly and utterly mystified by this, is that a great deal of what is happening in India today, which is what your question is about, you see, there's something which I really find very perplexing. I have no answers. I'm just raising it as a question. What you have in India today is the worst and most craven and crass kind of capitalism, which is sometimes the cliche crony capitalism is used to describe it. Right? And everybody knows that it's the Gujarati mafia of capital that is flourishing, and it's being privileged and favored in a way that is, there's just no doubt about it, that it is just brazenly being favored by the present government of the last 6 years. And you know, you could have predicted that this was going to happen if you looked at governance in the state itself, Gujarat itself. So now, earlier on. So now, here's a question I have. It's the reason why I'm so defeated and pessimistic is that it's not even a sane capitalist society in India.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because what I don't understand is, you see, I was brought up to believe, not at home, not in my domestic upbringing, but in my intellectual upbringing, I was brought up to believe that in a capitalist society, if 80% of the capitalist class wants something, it happens. Right? Okay. Now, what is 80% of the capitalist class in India doing now? The only person who makes some noises, and that's honorable, is Bajaj. Rahul Bajaj, and he's the only. What are the Narayan Murthis? What are the Azim Premjis? What are these guys doing? Right? I mean, there's a brazen favoring of a handful of capitalists, you know, and they're too scared to do anything. The 80% of the capitalist class just won't say anything. I mean, I don't understand it. You know, you can always say, I'm afraid that they will have income tax runs, they will have this run and that run. But look, there's a general principle. If 80% of the capitalist class wants something, it happens in a capitalist society. It's not happening in India. And so we really need to explain this. There's a certain kind of internal trajectory of rational development within capital. Socialists won't find it rational, but I'm saying within capitalism, and that's not even there in India, right? It's because 80% of the capitalist class is disaffected, but they can't do anything. They won't do anything, and you can't just say it's authoritarian. Okay, if you want to, maybe this is what fascism is. Right? Fascism is different from capitalism when 80% of the corporate class wants something and it doesn't happen. Okay, because of fear. All right, maybe that's one way to define fascism. I think it's a bit glib, but anyway, you can say that, and maybe that's true. The other thing I don't understand is, which I think is well worth studying, which is what makes us so different, and I share your pessimism about this, is that I really don't know anymore. I've studied it. I've tried to study it carefully, but I don't have an answer to the question, who is it who gets to call corruption? You see, Carl Schmitt, as I said, the fascist theorist, a brilliant guy, actually said sovereignty lies in the person or the authority who can declare the exception. Right? So you can have a constitution, but if somebody is in a position to say there's an emergency, declare the exception, that's where real sovereignty lies. So, okay, now I believe that given the kind of capitalist society India is, with so much corruption, etc., I think every party is corrupt. There's just no doubt about it. Maybe the CPM is not as corrupt as the others. Maybe AAP is not corrupt, whatever else it is. I don't have much respect for AAP anymore, but maybe it's not corrupt and CPM is not corrupt. But let's say any party which has any real clout is utterly corrupt. Okay. Now, why is it that UPA2 got to get called corrupt? But the present disgusting corrupt crony stuff going on doesn't get to be called corrupt. Right? So who gets to call corruption? I have tried to study the political economy of India. I've read very good people like, who was the man who was sacked by those idiots in charge of EPW? Thakurta.
Paranjay Thakurta.
Yeah.
Paranjay.
Paranjay, right? Impressive man, right? Impressive man. Maybe he has an analysis of this that I should try and talk to him. But I really don't understand this. I don't understand how, where that middle level of sovereignty lies, whereby they get to call corruption. Who has that sovereignty? How is it that UPA2 got corruption was called, but corruption is not being called now? Who has that sovereignty to call it? I don't know. I've been trying to study it. Fitfully. It's a very tedious thing to try and study, but I really don't have an answer to that. And maybe Paranjoy or somebody does. But that's another reason to share your pessimism. You see, because what I'm trying to tell you is that not only is the left decimated, but the sanity of it's a lumpen capitalism.
Yes.
Right? It's a lumpen capitalism, and most of the corporate sector is disaffected, and yet nothing can happen. That's how perplexing a problem it is, and somebody else may have answers to this, but I don't. Okay, I'm petering out. I'm going to stop.
Prabhakar, we are really sorry because it has been.
I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah, and Professor Bilgrami, thank you once again. Thank you very much for this illuminating talk. And we are really grateful you gave us so much time, 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours actually, 2 hours, 45 minutes. And we know how tiring it can get. And before I end, also, I would like to thank JGLS, Jindal Global Law School, for organizing this, especially the Dean of the school, Professor C. Rajkumar, who happens to be the Vice Chancellor also, the Executive Dean, Professor Srijit, and then, of course, other background staff. But most important, I would like to thank today's technical team. Mr. Satnam is here, who is handling the technical side. And they're going beyond their call of duty. Of course, you know, it's 9:15 at night and they're still at it. So thank you, a big thank you to all of you for being there and live streaming it and organizing it. And of course, my thanks to all the audience here who are still, you know, hanging around and listening to Professor Bilgrami. And so once again, I thank you, Professor Bilgrami, for agreeing to speak to us. And thank you so much. We really enjoyed. I had my own question. Maybe I'll ask you sometime when I'm in New York, not here. And hopefully that'll happen soon after the pandemic.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Jadumani.
Yes, I am here.
Oh,
yeah.
Unfortunately, you know, Professor Bilgrami has logged out. I thought I'll put you in touch with him, but I think he's tired. It's 3 hours now. It's tiring, actually. And thank you, Miss Imam, for joining us. It was great to see you.
It was an absolute pleasure. And please thank the organizers. I think they did a very fine job.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, Jadu, maybe sometime later, okay?
I would actually write an email to him.
I think now you can. Yeah, absolutely. You can go ahead and do that.
I spoke today, the rights and good. Actually, recently I wrote a piece. Also, it is part of my PhD work.
Okay.
It is better to write an email.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you so much, Musharraf, for organizing this really fascinating, illuminating talk. I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, so I would like to thank, you know, all the friends who are still here. Maz is here, Mursaid is here. Mursaid, hello.